You noticed it immediately. They made you something. Dinner, a document, a gesture, some arrangement of effort that took them time. And before gratitude had a chance to form, your attention had already located the thing that was wrong, the slightly off ratio, the word that wasn't quite right. The choice they made that you wouldn't have made. You saw it in the first seconds, and then you spent the next several minutes in a private negotiation. Do I mention it or don't I? And that negotiation, that careful internal calculation about whether to say the thing you cannot stop seeing, is what most people would call restraint, consideration, being tactful rather than blunt. It isn't restraint. It is the management of an already completed verdict. The noticing happened before you decided anything. The evaluation was done before generosity had a chance to operate. And what you've been calling your standards, the thing you would describe, if pressed, as caring about quality, as taking things seriously, as expecting from others the same level of effort you bring to things yourself, is not quite what it presents as. Something has been running underneath the standards for a long time, something that looks like discernment and functions like a weapon. And the reason it has been so hard to see is that the mechanism operates at a speed faster than intention, which means you have been genuinely confused when people experience your exacting eye as something other than care. You are not confused in the way that people are confused when they simply lack information. You are confused in the way that someone is confused when the mechanism producing their behavior is not available to direct introspection. The standard arrives complete. The verdict is issued before you've chosen to issue it. And then the conscious mind manages the aftermath, which means consciousness has been arriving after the act, not before it, and taking credit for a choice that was never quite a choice. What is possible on the other side of seeing this clearly is not lower standards. The standards are not the problem, and collapsing them would not solve anything. It would only produce a different form of dishonesty. What is possible is the capacity to know what the standard is actually doing, which means the standard stops being able to use you without your awareness. The verdict that arrives before you've deliberated loses its disguise. And what you do with it after that becomes an actual choice rather than a managed inevitability. But to get there, you have to follow the mechanism to where it originates. If this channel is naming things you haven't found named elsewhere, subscribe. That's how it reaches the people who need it. The mechanism that issues the verdict before you've chosen to, that involuntary noticing, that immediate location of the flaw, has a name in Nietzsche's account of human psychology, and the name is more precise than most people realize when they first encounter it. Ressentiment is not simply resentment with a French accent. Nietzsche introduced the term on the Genealogy of morality to describe a specific psychological movement, not a feeling, but a structural dynamic. It is the process by which a force that cannot be directly expressed gets converted into a moral framework. The crucial element is the indirection. Ressentiment does not say, "I am hostile to this." It says, "This falls short of the standard." It does not attack, it evaluates. The attack is present in the evaluation, but it arrives wearing the costume of discernment, of rigor, of genuine concern for quality. Nietzsche's original analysis was about the weak against the strong, the slave revolt in morality, where those who cannot overcome the powerful redefine powerlessness as virtue and power as vice. But the same structural movement operates at a different level in the perfectionist. The person with high standards is not typically someone who feels weak in relation to the people whose work they are evaluating. They feel, if anything, the opposite. But the mechanism is the same. A force that cannot be directly expressed gets routed through a framework of evaluation, and the framework makes the force invisible, not only to others, but to the person deploying it. Here is what this looks like at the table. You are not hostile to the person who made you dinner. You are not hostile to the colleague who sent you the draft. You genuinely want things to be good. You genuinely care about quality. All of this is true. And somewhere underneath all of it, organized around it, expressed through it, protected by it, is a charge that does not declare itself, a pressure that has been finding its outlet in the evaluation of every insufficient thing. And the insufficiency is never hard to find because the standard is calibrated to produce it. This is the part that is hard to sit with. The standard is not a measurement. It is a verdict delivered in advance, looking for confirmation. The standard is not saying, let me assess this fairly and arrive at a conclusion. It is saying, I already know what I am going to find, and I am now locating the evidence. And you cannot feel the difference from inside the process, because from inside the process, it simply feels like seeing clearly. Now here is where it becomes more uncomfortable, because Nietzsche alone does not take this far enough. Nietzsche's analysis identifies the ressentiment structure, but says relatively little about why this particular person routes their force this way. Why evaluation rather than direct confrontation? Why the standard rather than the accusation? Why genuine care and concealed aggression can inhabit the same gesture without the person ever experiencing a contradiction? For that, you need Jung, the shadow. Jung's term for the portion of the psyche that cannot be held within the persona structure does not always manifest as obvious darkness. In the perfectionist, the shadow is not the part that is cruel. It is the part that is ordinary, that is imprecise, that cuts corners, that makes things that are good enough rather than excellent. That accepts mediocrity in itself without the grinding self-judgment that paradoxically has become the primary emotional register of a life organized around standards. The perfectionist's persona is organized around the performance of rigor. What cannot fit inside that persona, the lazy impulse, the sloppy shortcut, the desire to produce something that is merely adequate and be done with it, gets pushed into the shadow. What the shadow does with that material in Jung's account is project it. The imprecision you cannot tolerate in yourself gets attributed to others. The mediocrity you cannot accept in your own work becomes the quality you are constantly locating in theirs. The judgment you direct outward is the shadow's preferred path for material that cannot be integrated inward. This is why the noticing is involuntary. You are not choosing to evaluate. You are projecting in the precise Jungian sense, which means the noticing is being driven by something in your interior that you have not yet faced as your own. The thing you cannot tolerate in them is the thing you cannot tolerate in yourself. And this is not a metaphor. It is a structural claim about what is actually happening when your attention moves at speed to the wrong ratio in what someone made for you. The imprecision they exhibited is not simply visible to you as a fact about their work. It is visible to you as an emergency, registered with a degree of urgency that the quality of a meal does not objectively warrant, because it is touching something that lives in you as an unexamined threat. Their ordinary imperfection is activating your unintegrated imprecision. The evaluation is pointed outward. The thing being evaluated is, at the underlying level, your own. This is why people experience your attention as something other than care. They are not wrong. Some portion of what lands on them when you notice their flaw is not really about them. It was generated by you in response to you and is being transmitted through them as a convenient surface. Now here is where Arendt enters and where her framework does something unexpected in this territory. Hannah Arendt's analysis of thoughtlessness is most commonly applied to the worst cases of human moral failure. The bureaucratic administrator who processes orders without examining them, the person who participates in harm through the specific failure to think. But the structure she described operates at every scale. Arendt argued that the most significant harm is produced not by malice, but by people who have stopped thinking, in her specific sense, which means stopped engaging in the internal dialogue that asks what one is actually doing and why. The administrator who processes the order without examining it has not suspended their intelligence. They have suspended the faculty that would allow them to encounter their own action as something requiring examination. Your standard operates this way, not at the scale of atrocity, but in the precise sense that the verdict arrives before thinking has occurred. The noticing, the immediate location of the flaw, the evaluation that completes itself before you've chosen to evaluate. This is the suspension of Arendt's thinking faculty. The mechanism runs, the verdict is produced, and then thinking arrives in the form of, do I mention it or don't I? Which is not thinking about what the standard is doing, but thinking about the management of its aftermath. The failure of thinking in your case is not about capacity. You are capable of extraordinary thinking. The failure is structural. The standard has been installed as a filter that runs before thinking can occur, and what runs before thinking cannot be examined by thinking, because thinking arrives downstream of it. This is why good intentions have not solved the problem. You can intend to be fair, to be generous, to allow for imperfection, to appreciate effort. And the noticing still happens at the speed of perception before your intentions had a chance to operate. Intention is downstream. The mechanism is upstream. Frankl argued that the space between stimulus and response is where human freedom lives, that the capacity to pause between what happens and what you do with it is the specifically human dimension of existence. In the perfectionist's mechanism, that space has been collapsed to something approaching zero. The stimulus arrives, the insufficient thing, and the response, the verdict, follows at a speed that bypasses the interval where deliberation would operate. What recovering that space requires is not a decision to notice less. The noticing will continue. The flaw will still be visible. What recovering that space requires is the capacity to receive the verdict as information rather than as instruction. To let the evaluation complete and then, before acting on it, insert the question, what is this verdict about in the full sense? Not just about the dinner, about the person who sees the dinner this way, about what is being managed in the seeing. That interval is very short at first. Frankl's point is not that it is comfortable to widen it. It is that widening it is what freedom costs in a situation like yours. And here is what the origin of this cost you when you finally face it directly. The standard was not adopted as a philosophy in adulthood. It was learned at a time when learning was the primary activity, as a response to something specific in the environment where you formed. Standards this exacting, this fast, this automatic. They were not produced by someone deciding that quality matters. They were produced by someone discovering that imprecision was costly, that something was at stake in their performance that was larger than the performance itself. Love, perhaps. Safety. The attention of someone whose attention was conditional on a standard you were always slightly failing to meet. The specific shape of the error that disappointed, and what followed from that disappointment. The standard was originally a survival strategy. The noticing was the capacity that kept something important from slipping. The speed of the evaluation was adaptive. It needed to be fast because the cost of being slow was real. And you were small, and you were paying attention the way that children pay attention when the stakes of inattention are not abstract. What happened next is what always happens with adaptive patterns that outlive the conditions that produced them. The pattern became the person. The survival strategy became a character trait. The noticing that was originally pointed outward toward the thing that needed to be corrected before it caused a problem turned inward too, until the self was being measured on the same terms as everything else. Until the standard was no longer a tool for managing a specific environment, but a structure of perception that applies itself continuously to everything, in every room, toward everyone, without being asked, including toward the people who are trying to love you. This is where Epictetus draws the line that is hardest to cross. The dichotomy of control has a specific application here that the self-improvement rendering of it always misses. Epictetus was not suggesting that you should care less about things outside your control. He was identifying a structural mismatch between a tool and the territory it is being applied to. The standard is a tool designed for your own production, for what you make, how you work, what you are willing to release under your name. Applied there, it has genuine function. The problem is the territory it has expanded into. Other people's efforts, other people's choices, other people's imprecision in the things they made for you. There is no version of looking at another person's effort through the perfectionist's eye that does not find what the eye is calibrated to find. The tool and the task are mismatched, and the mismatch produces not quality, the ostensible goal, but a permanent supply of occasions for the verdict. Epictetus would say, examine not the flaw you see, but the belief that the verdict must be delivered. The flaw is present. You cannot unsee it. But the belief that something requires you to register it, carry it, manage it, either mention it or suppress it, that belief is in your power to examine, and examining it reveals that it is not about the flaw. It is about the need to have a verdict, which is not the same thing. Now, here is the thing that most people who recognize themselves in this description will immediately attempt: the decision to mention it less. Not mentioning it is not the same as the standard losing its grip. You can become skilled at withholding the critique, and the mechanism continues to run. Invisibly now, metabolized internally, issuing the verdict without the stated criticism. The person on the other side does not receive the critique, but they receive something else. The quality of your attention when you are in the middle of managing a completed verdict, the slight withholding in your response to their thing, the appreciation that is real but does not quite land with full weight because some portion of you is still in the evaluation. They feel it. They usually cannot name it, but they feel it as the specific experience of being in the presence of someone who is slightly elsewhere, slightly occupied, slightly in the middle of something they have decided not to share. And the relationship adjusts to that feeling over time. What you have created across years of this is a collection of people who have stopped bringing you their full efforts, who self-edit before showing you, who manage their exposure to your eye in the way that anyone learns to manage exposure to a surface they know is evaluative, not because they are fragile, because they are rational. They have learned from experience what your attention does, and they have adjusted accordingly. This is the specific harm that the good intention does not prevent. Camus would name what the standard is structurally organized to do, and this is the part that is most difficult to receive. The absurd, in Camus' account, is the collision between the human need for things to make sense, to be orderly, to meet what is required of them, and the world's fundamental indifference to that need. The perfectionist has been at war with that indifference for the entire duration of the pattern. But here is what the war requires to continue: a continuous supply of things that fail. The standard cannot exist without the insufficient thing, not as a logical matter. Obviously, a standard can be stated without a failure to point to, but as a psychological matter. The standard that finds everything sufficient is not a standard that is doing anything for the person holding it. It is a standard that has stopped producing the specific experience that the mechanism was built to produce. What experience is that? Not quality. Not the arrival of excellence finally, after so much inadequate material. The experience the mechanism produces is the experience of clarity, of knowing with certainty what is wrong, of having an orientation in a world that is otherwise ambiguous, that does not tell you where you stand, that does not confirm your location. The verdict is not primarily about the thing being evaluated. It is about the evaluator's position. Above the insufficient thing, looking at it with the clear eye that sees what others miss. The standard, in this account, requires imperfection to exist. Not as a cynical calculation, you are not seeking out flaws so that you can feel superior, but structurally, the mechanism that generates the verdict needs something to generate verdicts about. And in the absence of insufficient things, the bar rises. The threshold shifts, not because quality is declining, but because the mechanism requires material to process. The cruelty is not in the verdict you deliver. It is in what the need for the verdict does to the people who keep trying to give you something that meets it. What would it mean to let something be enough? Not to lower the standard, not to pretend the flaw is not there, but to complete the evaluation and then not act on it, not manage it, not transmit it in softened form, not carry it through the interaction as a weight the other person can feel. To receive what someone made with the full weight of what they intended it to carry, without routing that weight through the measurement first. This is not a practice that arrives with comfort. It arrives with a specific disorientation, the loss of the verdict as a navigational tool. If the standard is not always running, if the evaluation does not complete at the usual speed, the position it typically provides, I am the one who sees clearly, becomes uncertain. And that position was doing more work than measuring quality. It was doing the work of locating you, of placing you in a definite relationship to things, rather than the more open and uncertain relationship of simply receiving them. You are not a person with high standards. You are a person with something that needed a location, that found one in the certainty of evaluation, and that has been returning there ever since. The standards are real. The care for quality is real. The thing behind them, the one that needs the insufficiency in order to know where it stands, that is also real. And that third thing does not yield to a decision. It yields, if it yields at all, to the kind of slow and uncomfortable attention that the mechanism has been routing away from itself for as long as it has been running, which, for most people who carry this pattern, is most of their life.